Growing up in my family wasn't just hard, it was like carrying an invisible weight that no one else seemed to notice. My parents, David and Linda, had a knack for making me feel less like their eldest son and more like their unpaid assistant. While other kids were out riding bikes or going to the mall, I was stuck mopping floors or running after my younger siblings, Liam, Sophie. As I grew older, the demands didn't lessen. If anything, they worsened. My father had this smug way of reminding me that family came first, though what he really meant was that I came last. Linda, my mom, would shower the younger kids with love and attention but looked at me like I was a tool she could pick up whenever she needed something fixed or someone to blame. Every good report card, every personal achievement, every little milestone of mine went unnoticed while my siblings' smallest accomplishments were celebrated as if they'd cured cancer. The breaking point came when I turned 20. I had been saving every spare penny from part-time jobs since high school, determined to carve out a life for myself far from their controlling grip. When I announced I was moving out, David's reaction was predictably cold. He didn't even bother to hide his disdain. He said, "If you leave, don't bother coming back." It was less a threat and more a dismissal, as if he couldn't be bothered to care whether I stayed or left. For once, I called his bluff. I packed my bags and left without looking back. The first night in my tiny, one-room apartment was the most peaceful moment I'd had in years. It wasn't much, a lumpy mattress on the floor, second-hand furniture that smelled faintly of mildew, and a drafty window that rattled when the wind blew. But it was mine. For the first time, I felt free. Over the next few years, I worked hard to build a life for myself. I took on double shifts, went back to school part-time, and slowly upgraded my situation. I didn't hear much from my parents during this time, which suited me just fine. Occasionally, they'd call, but it was never to check on how I was doing. It was always about them. David lost his job and needed money. Linda was overwhelmed with the kids and needed help. They framed their pleas as family emergencies, but I knew better. I learned to ignore their calls, letting them go to voicemail where their guilt-laden messages couldn't touch me. But one day, they changed tactics. Linda started showing up unannounced. The first time, it was under the guise of just wanting to check on me. She brought Sophie and Liam along, whose wide-eyed stares made me feel like the bad guy for even considering sending them away. She'd linger for hours, subtly dropping hints about how hard things were back home. Eventually, she stopped pretending. It became clear they wanted me to move back and resume my role as their live-in helper. Each time, I refused, and each time, Linda left with a disappointed sigh, as if I were failing some unspoken test of loyalty. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Thursday evening, and I had just come home from a grueling shift. My plan was simple: take a shower, eat something vaguely edible, and collapse into bed. But as I approached my apartment, I noticed something strange. Two figures sat huddled on the stairs leading to my door. As I got closer, my stomach dropped. It was Liam and Sophie, their small backpacks resting by their feet. They looked up at me with a mix of relief and unease, as if they weren't sure whether I'd be happy to see them. A note was taped to Liam's backpack. It was from Linda. In her scrawling handwriting, she explained that she had no choice and needed me to watch the kids for a few days, because she was overwhelmed. She promised she'd be back soon but gave no specific timeline. My head spun as I read and reread the note. The audacity of it all. She hadn't even called to ask. She had just decided that my life didn't matter enough to warrant a conversation. Standing there on the dimly lit stairwell, staring at my siblings who looked just as confused as I felt, I realized this wasn't just about babysitting. It was about control. Linda and David had found a new way to reel me back in. The question now was whether I'd let them. When Linda dumped Liam and Sophie on my doorstep, I knew the gloves had to come off. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an ambush. I spent the first few minutes reassuring the kids that everything was fine, though I was simmering with rage beneath the surface. They had no idea what was happening, and it wasn't their fault. I set them up on the couch with some snacks and quietly fumed in the kitchen, my mind racing through what to do next. Calling Linda felt pointless, she'd already made it clear she wouldn't answer. The note was her version of a conversation, one-sided and designed to absolve her of responsibility. But I wasn't about to let this slide. I wrote a message and sent it to both her and David. It was short and to the point: if they ever left the kids with me unannounced again, I'd involve the police. For good measure, I mentioned Child Protective Services. It was a low blow, but at that moment, I didn't care. I wasn't going to be strong-armed into their mess. Hours passed without a response. The kids eventually fell asleep, and I moved them to my bed while I tried to piece together a plan. My life was simple, and I wanted it to stay that way. Taking care of my siblings, as much as I cared about them, wasn't part of the deal. The following morning, Linda finally called, sounding outraged rather than apologetic. She accused me of overreacting, said I was selfish for threatening the family, and then hung up before I could get a word in. I wasn't surprised, but the audacity still left me stunned. A few days later, I came home from work to find my apartment had been broken into. Nothing was damaged, but it didn't take long to notice what was missing: my gaming console. It wasn't just an expensive piece of tech, it was my stress relief after long shifts and a symbol of the small joys I'd worked so hard to afford. I didn't need to play detective to figure out who was behind it. Linda and David had likely used their spare key, a leftover relic from when I'd briefly trusted them to visit without notice. The next morning, I drove to their house. My heart pounded as I stepped onto the porch, anger and adrenaline fueling me. The door opened before I could knock. David stood there, looking smug, as if he'd been expecting me. He didn't even try to deny it. He said the console was fair payment for all the times they'd supported me as a child. His logic was as twisted as ever. I demanded it back, but he laughed, saying I'd only get it if I started acting like part of the family again. For a moment, I felt a flicker of doubt. Maybe I was being too harsh. Maybe family really did mean putting up with things like this. But then Linda appeared behind him. She wasn't her usual composed self, she looked conflicted, almost embarrassed. When David left to grab something from another room, she motioned for me to follow her to the kitchen. What she said next caught me completely off guard. She admitted that taking the console had been David's idea and that she hadn't agreed with it. She even went so far as to say she'd talked to him about returning it. For a brief moment, I felt a strange sense of validation. Maybe, just maybe, she was starting to see how unfairly they'd treated me. But the moment didn't last. When David returned, he immediately sensed the shift in the room. Linda's hesitation hadn't gone unnoticed, and he launched into a tirade about loyalty and respect. He accused her of undermining him and demanded that she back him up. The tension between them was palpable, and I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. Their dynamic, always rocky, was beginning to crack under the weight of their own manipulations. Linda's brief show of support dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. Under David's glare, she folded, saying I needed to apologize for threatening the family. The anger I'd been holding back erupted. I reminded them, in no uncertain terms, that I owed them nothing. I'd built my life without their help, and I wasn't about to let them guilt me into submission. Before leaving, I made sure to grab my console from where David had hidden it in the living room. He yelled something as I walked out, but I didn't stop to listen. As I drove away, I felt a mix of triumph and frustration. I had stood my ground, but it was clear this wasn't over. David and Linda weren't the type to let go easily, and their desperation was only growing. The entire ordeal left me wondering how far they'd go to pull me back into their orbit. For the first time, I felt a twinge of fear. They weren't just manipulative, they were dangerous in their willingness to bend the rules and blur boundaries. I'd won this round, but the battle was far from over. Weeks passed, and I resolved to enforce the boundaries I'd set. If Linda and David wanted me to babysit, it would only happen on my terms, prepayment upfront and clear, specific conditions. No more ambushes or manipulative guilt trips. Unsurprisingly, they didn't take me up on the offer. Instead, I endured a stretch of passive-aggressive silence, no calls, no surprise visits, nothing. For a moment, I thought they'd finally given up, but deep down, I knew better. They weren't the type to let things lie for long. Sure enough, the peace shattered one Friday evening. I came home after a long day, exhausted but looking forward to a quiet night. As I approached my apartment, a familiar sense of dread crept over me. Liam and Sophie were there again, sitting on the stairs outside my door. Their faces lit up when they saw me, but my heart sank. This time, there was no note, no explanation. Linda had left them there without so much as a warning. I'd seen this coming and had prepared for it. My first instinct was to reassure the kids, making sure they felt safe. I brought them inside, gave them something to eat, and set them up with a movie. Then, I made the call I'd been dreading but knew was necessary. I dialed the police and reported the situation as child abandonment. When the officers arrived, they were professional but clearly uncomfortable. Liam and Sophie were too young to understand what was happening, but their confusion cut me deeply. I had no choice but to explain, as gently as I could, that this was the only way to ensure they were safe. The officers took statements, and eventually, social services became involved. Linda was contacted and told to pick up the kids immediately. She arrived an hour later, furious and hurling accusations. Her anger didn't faze me. I stood firm, pointing out that leaving two children alone without notice was reckless and unacceptable. The fallout was swift. Linda was fined for child abandonment, a slap on the wrist that wouldn't change her behavior but at least served as a wake-up call. David, predictably, blamed me for everything. He called to berate me, saying I'd destroyed the family and painted myself as a victim. His words were laced with venom, but they didn't sting like they used to. I'd grown immune to his attempts to tear me down. This confrontation marked a turning point for me. I realized that no matter how much I tried to distance myself, David and Linda would always see me as an extension of their control. Their manipulation wasn't about love or family, it was about maintaining power. I refused to be a pawn in their game any longer. Despite the chaos, the experience also clarified something important. I wasn't alone in this fight. Friends and colleagues who'd heard snippets of the story offered support, reminding me that my boundaries were valid and necessary. Their encouragement gave me the strength to keep pushing forward, even when it felt like an uphill battle. In the days that followed, I doubled down on my independence. I changed the locks on my apartment to ensure there were no more surprise break-ins. I blocked David and Linda on every platform, leaving only one emergency contact line open for genuine emergencies involving the kids. I even consulted a lawyer to understand my rights, just in case their antics escalated further. But the hardest part wasn't the practicalities, it was the emotional toll. Walking away from family, even toxic family, isn't easy. There were moments when I second-guessed myself, wondering if I was being too harsh or selfish. Then I'd remember the look on Liam and Sophie's faces that night, the confusion and sadness they'd felt because of Linda's choices. That memory solidified my resolve. I wasn't the villain here, I was just trying to survive. The estrangement with David deepened after the incident. He'd always been the enforcer in the family, the one who demanded obedience without question. For him, my defiance was an unforgivable betrayal. He escalated his rhetoric, painting me as the ungrateful son who'd abandoned his family in their time of need. But no matter how loud his accusations became, they couldn't drown out the truth, I owed them nothing. Linda, meanwhile, tried to mend fences in her own way. She reached out occasionally, her tone softer but still tinged with manipulation. She'd mention how much the younger kids missed me or how hard things were at home. I saw through it, recognizing the same old tactics wrapped in a new package. Each time, I reminded her of the boundaries we discussed and refused to engage further. This new chapter in my life wasn't easy, but it was necessary. For the first time, I felt like I was truly standing on my own 2 feet, free from the chains of guilt and obligation that had bound me for so long. The road ahead was uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't turning back. Thanksgiving loomed like an impending storm cloud. I'd avoided family gatherings for years, knowing that every invite was less about celebration and more about control. But this time, something gnawed at me. Linda's call had been unusually measured, almost pleading. She promised a low-key dinner, just family, no drama. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Deep down, I suspected a trap, but part of me wanted to prove that I could face them on my terms. When I arrived at the house, the air was thick with unspoken tension. The dining room table was crowded with mismatched dishes and half-hearted decorations, but it couldn't mask the underlying unease. Linda flitted between the kitchen and dining room, her smile brittle as she tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy. David sat at the head of the table, his presence as domineering as ever. The younger kids seemed oblivious, their laughter ringing out as they played in the living room. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't end in disaster. That hope evaporated as soon as dinner began. The conversation started innocently enough, with polite inquiries about work and life. But it didn't take long for David to steer the discussion into dangerous territory. He began talking about family responsibilities, his tone sharp and pointed. It wasn't long before he turned his attention to me, questioning why I had abandoned them when they needed me most. I kept my responses calm, refusing to take the bait. But David wasn't interested in a discussion, he wanted submission. As the meal progressed, his accusations grew louder, his words dripping with disdain. He demanded that I move back home, claiming it was time for me to pay my dues. He listed off the ways I could help, from paying rent to resuming my role as a caregiver for the younger kids. It was clear he'd been waiting for this moment, his tirade rehearsed and calculated. I'd prepared for this. Before coming, I'd set my phone to record, tucking it discreetly in my jacket pocket. As David's voice rose, I let him continue, knowing that every word he spoke would serve as evidence if things escalated. And escalate they did. When I refused his demands, he lost what little composure he had left. His face turned red, and he slammed his fist on the table, sending silverware clattering to the floor. Linda tried to intervene, her voice shaking as she pleaded for calm, but David was beyond reason. He stood, towering over me, and demanded that I apologize for disrespecting him. When I remained seated, his rage boiled over. He reached for my arm, attempting to pull me to my feet, but I resisted. Years of suppressed anger surged to the surface, and for the first time, I stood my ground. In the struggle, I shoved him back, and he stumbled, falling into a chair with a loud crash. The room fell silent. The younger kids, drawn by the commotion, peered around the corner with wide, frightened eyes. Linda looked torn between anger and fear, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. David struggled to regain his footing, his expression a mix of shock and humiliation. For a moment, no one moved. Then, I spoke. My voice was steady, but the weight of my words hung heavy in the air. I told them that this was the last time I would tolerate their attempts to control me. I made it clear that I had recorded everything, ensuring that any lies or accusations they might concoct would be useless. The power dynamic shifted in that instant. For the first time, I saw fear in David's eyes, a realization that he couldn't manipulate his way out of this. Before leaving, I walked to the kitchen, grabbed a plate, and began filling it with food. It was a petty gesture, but it felt symbolic, a reminder that I could take what I needed without their permission. As I walked out the door, plate in hand, I felt an unfamiliar sense of closure. This wasn't just an escape, it was a declaration of independence. The drive home was quiet, the weight of the evening settling in. I knew this wouldn't be the end of their attempts to drag me back into their chaos, but for now, I had won. The recording was my safeguard, a shield against their manipulations. More importantly, I had reclaimed my voice, refusing to let their toxicity dictate my life any longer. Thanksgiving had always been a time for reflection, and this year, I reflected on the family I'd chosen, the friends and mentors who had supported me, the life I'd built on my own terms. They were my real family, and for the first time, I felt truly grateful. Months passed, and life settled into a semblance of normalcy. I focused on my work and friends, determined to leave the chaos of my family behind. But peace has a way of being fleeting, especially when it comes to David and Linda. One evening, I received a call from an old neighbor who still lived near my parents. They mentioned seeing Linda on crutches and asked if I knew what had happened. The news struck me like a lightning bolt. I hadn't spoken to her or David since Thanksgiving, and the idea of her being injured stirred conflicting emotions, curiosity, concern, and a guarded sense of detachment. Over the next few days, I debated whether to visit. Finally, the weight of unanswered questions became too much to bear. I decided to confront them, not out of obligation, but to get the closure I needed. Arriving at their house, I noticed how much it had changed. The once pristine lawn was overgrown, the shutters sagged, and the air around the place felt heavy, almost oppressive. Linda greeted me at the door, leaning heavily on her crutches. Her face was pale, her features drawn with exhaustion. She ushered me inside without a word, her silence unnerving. David sat in his usual spot, but he looked older, wearier. His posture was rigid, and his left hand twitched intermittently, a remnant of the injuries he'd sustained during our last confrontation. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating, the tension palpable. After a strained silence, Linda broke the news. She'd been pregnant for months without telling anyone. The miscarriage had happened shortly after Thanksgiving, and they blamed me for it. According to them, my refusal to move back home had caused Linda undue stress, leading to the loss. Their words hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't known, couldn't have known, but their accusations reopened old wounds, the familiar sting of guilt and manipulation seeping in. I fought to stay calm, reminding myself that this was their pattern, finding scapegoats for their pain instead of taking responsibility. I asked why they hadn't reached out if things were so dire. David's response was predictable. He accused me of abandoning them, of being selfish and ungrateful. But as he spoke, I noticed cracks in his armor. His voice wavered, and his words lacked their usual venom. For the first time, I saw them for what they truly were, a broken, desperate pair, clinging to control as their world crumbled around them. The argument escalated quickly. David's anger reignited, and his voice grew louder, more frantic. At one point, he reached into the side table drawer and pulled out a hunting knife. The sight of the blade sent a chill down my spine. He brandished it, his hand shaking, as he yelled about respect and obedience. Linda tried to intervene, but her physical state left her powerless to stop him. I stood my ground, my heart pounding. Keeping my voice steady, I told David that I wasn't there to fight. I reminded him of the recording from Thanksgiving, subtly implying that any violence would end badly for him. Slowly, he lowered the knife, his rage giving way to exhaustion. It was a small victory, but the air remained thick with unresolved tension. Before leaving, I turned to Linda and David and said the words I'd been holding back for years. I told them that their cycle of control and abuse ended with me. I vowed to protect my younger siblings, to ensure they wouldn't grow up feeling the same sense of worthlessness I'd endured. I made it clear that I wouldn't let them drag Liam and Sophie down with them. Linda's expression shifted, a mix of shock and something that resembled regret. David said nothing, his eyes fixed on the floor. As I walked out, I felt the weight of their gaze but refused to look back. This time, I wasn't leaving defeated. I was leaving with a purpose. In the days that followed, I began making plans. I reached out to trusted contacts, researching ways to support Liam and Sophie when the time came. I couldn't legally take them in now, but I could pave the way for their escape once they turned 19. It wasn't just about getting them out, it was about breaking the chain of toxicity that had defined our family for so long. The journey ahead was daunting, but I felt a renewed sense of determination. My parents had spent years trying to break me, but instead, they'd forged someone stronger. I was no longer their pawn. I was the architect of my own future, and soon, I'd help my siblings build theirs too. The weeks following my last visit to my parents' house were a whirlwind of action and reflection. I knew I couldn't leave things open-ended. The threat of David's unpredictable behavior loomed too large. Filing for a restraining order was the first step. The process wasn't easy. Reliving the worst moments of my family history for legal documents felt like ripping open wounds that had barely begun to heal. But I pushed through, knowing it was necessary to establish firm boundaries once and for all. The court granted the restraining order without much resistance. David's reputation in the community, already tarnished by years of erratic behavior, worked against him. For the first time, I felt the weight of his presence begin to lift. The restraining order was more than a legal barrier, it was a symbolic one, a clear line I'd drawn to protect myself and my future. Securing a better-paying job became my next priority. I'd been working hard at my current position, but the limited pay made long-term stability feel just out of reach. After months of networking and interviewing, I landed a role that offered both financial security and a fresh start. It came with an added bonus. The job was in another state, far enough away to ensure that Linda and David couldn't easily intrude. As I packed up my apartment, memories of the past few years swirled around me. Each box I taped shut felt like closing a chapter. There were moments of sadness, yes, but also pride. I'd fought tooth and nail to carve out a life that was mine, free from the shadows of manipulation and guilt. The scars of my upbringing were still there, faint but permanent reminders of what I'd endured. Yet, those scars didn't define me. They were marks of survival, of resilience. Before leaving, I made one final visit to Liam and Sophie. They were older now, beginning to understand the dynamics of our family in a way they hadn't before. I didn't sugarcoat the reality of our situation, but I made them a promise: when they turned 19, I'd help them escape the cycle of abuse for good. We'd stay in touch, and I'd be there for them, no matter what. Their hugs lingered as I said goodbye, a silent but powerful reminder of why I was doing all this. The move felt like a rebirth. My new apartment was modest but bright, filled with possibilities rather than memories. The city itself was a revelation, a place where no one knew my history, where I could walk the streets without fear of running into a familiar, judgmental face. I threw myself into my new job, finding satisfaction in the work and the freedom it afforded me. For the first time, I began to imagine a future that wasn't defined by my past. Reflecting on my journey, I realized how much I'd grown. The boy who once felt trapped under his parents' thumb had become a man capable of standing tall against them. The sacrifices had been immense: estrangement from family, years of self-doubt, and countless nights spent questioning my decisions. But every step had been worth it. I'd reclaimed my life and built something that felt genuine and true. Still, the weight of my siblings' future lingered. Liam and Sophie were still under Linda and David's roof, navigating the same toxic environment I'd fought so hard to escape. But I took solace in knowing that I'd planted a seed. They knew there was a way out, and when the time came, I'd be there to guide them. The cycle of abuse that had defined our family for generations would end with us. It had to. On my first night in the new city, I sat on my balcony and looked out over the skyline. The air was crisp, the lights below twinkling with a promise of possibility. I felt a mix of emotions, relief, hope, and a quiet determination. The journey had been grueling, but I'd emerged stronger, more focused. This was my life now, shaped not by the pain of the past but by the choices I'd made to move beyond it. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. And that freedom, hard-won and fragile, was something I'd protect at all costs.